The city lights blurred beneath a curtain of falling snow. Cars hissed over wet asphalt, and people rushed past wrapped in layers of warmth, eyes down, hearts elsewhere. At the corner of the street, beside a flickering lamppost, an old woman sat on the frozen pavement. Her coat was torn, her hands trembling as she cupped them around a paper cup with only a few coins inside. The world moved around her, indifferent, fast, and loud. But among the blur of headlights and hurried steps, one figure slowed down. Lila Beaumont, the daughter of one of the city's most powerful billionaires, had just left a charity gala. The music still echoed faintly in her mind, the clinking glasses, polite laughter, and speeches about generosity that felt hollow now. As her chauffeur pulled the sleek black car to a stop at a red light, her eyes caught the shape of the woman. Something inside her tightened, an ache she couldn't name. The woman looked up, eyes glassy with cold and disbelief. For a second, their worlds touched, wealth and poverty, privilege and pain. Lila whispered, "Stop the car." "Before we dive deeper, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? It amazes me how far a single story can travel." "Drop your city. Let's see how wide kindness still spreads." The driver hesitated, confused. "Miss Beaumont, it's dangerous here." But Lila had already opened the door, the cold biting into her skin like needles. She approached the woman slowly, kneeling down so their eyes were level. "Hi," she said softly. "Are you all right?" The woman's voice cracked, more whisper than sound. "I'm cold." Without thinking, Lila shrugged off a fur-lined coat and wrapped it around her. The fabric swallowed the woman's small frame, and for the first time that night, she stopped shivering. "Come with me," Lila said. The woman blinked, startled. "I can't." They don't let people like me in those cars." Lila smiled faintly. "Then tonight, they'll have to learn." She helped her to her feet and guided her toward the waiting car. The driver's eyes widened in the mirror. "Miss Beaumont, your father." "I'll handle him," she interrupted, voice steady but kind. The woman sat gingerly, afraid to stain the leather seats. Lila noticed her hands, red, cracked, shaking. She took them gently, trying to warm them with her own. They drove in silence through the glowing city. The heater hummed softly. Lila didn't ask how the woman ended up here. Not yet. Sometimes silence is the kindest form of respect. Finally, she spoke. "What's your name?" "Grace," the woman said after a pause. "My name's Grace." Lila smiled. "That's a beautiful name." Grace looked at her, puzzled. "You don't have to do this. You know, people like me, we're invisible." "Not tonight," Lila whispered. "If you were there in that moment, what would you have done? Be honest. Comment your answer below. And if words fail you, just hit like to prove that compassion still matters." The car turned into a quiet street lined with trees glittering under frost. Lila had the driver stop in front of a 24-hour cafe, the kind that smelled like coffee and tired hope. "Let's get you warm first," she said. Grace hesitated. "I don't have money." Lila smiled gently. "I think I can cover a cup of coffee." Inside, the heat was almost shocking after the cold. Steam rose from mugs, and holiday music played softly in the background. They found a booth near the window. Grace held her cup like it was the most precious thing in the world. For the first time in years, she smiled. It was small, fragile, but real. Lila watched her quietly, wondering how something so simple could feel more meaningful than every charity event she'd ever attended. "Where will you go after this?" she asked. Grace looked out the window at the snow. "I don't know. I just tried to survive one night at a time." Lila bit her lip. Something deep inside her shifted, the realization that survival shouldn't be a daily miracle. The world outside kept rushing, but in that small booth, time seemed to slow. And as Grace spoke softly about the life she once had, a job, a husband, a home, Lila felt a strange mix of guilt and purpose rise within her. Her phone buzzed. Her father's name flashed on the screen. She silenced it. Tonight wasn't about money or power. It was about humanity. The snow outside thickened, but in that moment, warmth returned to two souls who had almost forgotten what it felt like. The cafe lights glowed softly against the storm outside, the hum of the heater and faint clinking of cups wrapping the room in a cocoon of quiet warmth. Grace's trembling hand steadied as she took another sip, her eyes softening as if she was remembering what comfort felt like. Lila watched her in silence, torn between admiration and heartbreak. "Thank you," Grace murmured, voice barely audible over the hum. "No one's stopped for me in months." "You don't need to thank me," Lila said gently. "You deserve warmth. Everyone does." Grace smiled faintly, a ghost of who she once was flickering behind her tired expression. "You sound like someone who's never had to fight for it." Lila hesitated. She wanted to protest, but she couldn't. Grace was right. She'd never known what it meant to go hungry or cold. But she had fought in her own way, against the expectations of a world that judged her for her name before her heart. The two women sat for a while longer before Lila glanced at her phone again. Dozens of missed calls. Her father was relentless. The moment she stepped outside this cafe, she'd have to face him, the man whose name carried both fortune and fear. Grace noticed her expression. "You should go," she said softly. "You've done enough." Lila looked at her, eyes fierce with something deeper than pity. "Not yet." She took out a small card and slid it across the table. "This is my number. Tomorrow, meet me at the Beaumont Foundation office. Tell them I sent you." Grace's eyes widened. "You're serious?" Lila smiled. "Completely." The older woman's fingers trembled as she touched the card. "I don't know how to thank you, miss." "Just Lila," she interrupted. "No titles tonight." As they left the cafe, the wind howled like a living thing. The driver opened the car door hesitantly, but Lila held up a hand. "I'll walk her home." Grace blinked. "Home? You mean the shelter?" Lila nodded. "If that's where you're staying, then yes. No one should walk there alone in this weather." They walked side by side under the falling snow, the city quieter now, the world feeling oddly smaller. Grace talked, not much, but enough to let fragments of her story fall like pieces of broken glass. She had been a nurse once, before the hospital cut staff. Her husband had died 2 winters ago. Rent followed soon after. The streets became her only roof. As Lila listened, guilt and admiration intertwined. Grace's voice carried no bitterness, only exhaustion and the strange peace of someone who had stopped expecting miracles. When they reached the old brick shelter, Grace turned. "You didn't have to do this," she said. Lila smiled. "Maybe not, but sometimes the smallest choices change everything." Grace's eyes shimmered. "You sound like him." "Who?" "My husband," she whispered. "He used to say that before life took him away." The door creaked open behind her, a volunteer waving Grace in. Before she disappeared inside, she turned one last time. "Thank you, Lila. You didn't just give me warmth tonight. You gave me hope." Lila's throat tightened, her breath fogging the air. "Then promise me you'll come tomorrow." Grace nodded. "I will." Lila stood there for a long moment after she left, the wind tugging at her hair. The feeling in her chest was strange, light and heavy all at once. Her phone buzzed again. "Father." She sighed and finally answered. "Hi, Dad." His voice thundered through the line. "Where have you been? I heard from the driver you picked up some woman off the street. Do you have any idea how that looks?" "Like kindness," she said quietly. "Like recklessness." He snapped. "You're a Beaumont, not some street savior. People like her don't change." Lila's jaw tightened. Maybe that's because people like us never give them a chance. Silence. Then a sharp exhale. "Come home. Now." She hung up, her heart racing. For the first time, she wasn't afraid to stand up to him. "Have you ever had someone help you when no one else would?" "Right, yes. And tell me their name. Maybe gratitude can travel further than we think." That night, Lila couldn't sleep. Her father's words echoed in her mind, colliding with Grace's trembling smile. The next morning, she dressed simply, no designer coat, no chauffeured car, just a plain sweater and determination. When she arrived at the foundation office, Grace was already there, sitting nervously in the lobby, the car clutched like a ticket to another life. Lila smiled warmly. "You came." Grace stood, unsure whether to hug her or bow. I said I would. Lila led her inside. Let's find you something to do here. Something that feels like purpose again. Grace blinked. You mean a job? Lila nodded. Everyone deserves a second beginning. And as the two women stepped into the bright corridor lined with portraits of donors and charities, something unseen shifted again, a quiet rebellion against indifference. What neither of them knew was that this act of kindness would ignite a storm much bigger than either expected, one that would test love, pride, and the fragile boundaries between wealth and worth. Grace's fingers trembled as she held the pen above the employment form. The paper felt heavier than it should, like the weight of every failure she'd survived was pressing against it. Her eyes glistened as she looked at Lila, who stood beside her, smiling softly, patient as if this moment mattered as much as any grand business deal. It's been so long since anyone trusted me, Grace murmured. Lila knelt slightly, her tone warm. You've earned this chance, Grace. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. The HR manager, clearly unsure why a homeless woman sat in a pristine office, kept his gaze low and his tone professional. Miss Beaumont, are you certain about this placement? Lila nodded. Completely. She'll assist with our outreach division. She knows more about survival than most of our board members ever will. The man hesitated but stamped the approval. Welcome to the Beaumont Foundation, Ms. Grace Turner. Grace blinked at the name, Ms. Turner, like hearing herself reborn. Tears pooled but didn't fall. She managed a shaky smile. Thank you. Lila led her out of the office into the bright hallway where glass walls overlooked the city. Below, people hurried, unaware that somewhere up here, a miracle had just taken its first breath. As they walked, Grace whispered, You don't even know me, Lila. Why do all this? Lila stopped, her expression thoughtful. Because if I don't, I'll keep pretending my world is complete, when it's not. Grace nodded slowly. You sound like someone searching for something. Lila smiled faintly. Maybe I am. That evening, news of the event somehow reached her father. A single act of compassion had traveled faster than Lila imagined. At dinner, the atmosphere was tense. Her father's jaw locked, her mother silent as the servants hovered awkwardly in the background. Her father finally spoke. I've seen the reports. My daughter hiring a vagrant? Do you realize how that looks? It looks human, Lila said quietly. Michael Beaumont's gaze hardened. This family's reputation is not a toy. You think kindness fixes the world? It makes you weak. Then I'd rather be weak than heartless, Lila replied. Her mother flinched at the tone, calm but defiant. Michael's voice rose. You have no idea how this world works. You help one, 10 more show up. They'll drain you until there's nothing left. Lila met his glare. Maybe what drains us isn't helping people, but pretending we don't see them. He slammed his napkin down and left the table. The sound echoed like thunder. Her mother reached out weakly. Lila, he just worries. You know your father's heart isn't as cold as he seems. Lila looked at her mother. Then maybe it's time he remembered it exists. That night, Lila couldn't sleep again. The mansion felt colder than the street she'd walked with Grace. She wandered through the long hallways until she reached her late mother's old art studio, untouched for years. Canvases stood under dust, colors faded but still alive somehow. Her mother had been the gentle balance to her father's empire building, and since she passed, the house had felt like a shrine of silence. Lila sat on the stool, staring at a half-finished painting, a pair of hands reaching toward each other, never touching. Her chest ached. Maybe that was what all of this was about, reaching for something just out of grasp. The next morning, she arrived early at the foundation. Grace was already working, arranging files, helping volunteers prepare packages for the winter drive. The transformation was subtle but profound, her posture straighter, her voice steadier. When she saw Lila, she smiled. Feels strange to belong somewhere again. Feels right, Lila replied. We'll make sure it stays that way. Grace hesitated, then asked, Do you really think your father will be okay with this? Lila sighed. He won't, but maybe he doesn't need to be. Not yet. Grace placed a gentle hand on her arm. You're brave. I lost that somewhere along the way. Lila shook her head. You didn't lose it. You just needed someone to remind you it's still there. Now it's your turn. Share one small good thing you did recently. Write it below so others remember that humanity still lives. Your story might light someone's path tonight. The days passed, and whispers spread through the foundation. The story of the billionaire's daughter who had hired a homeless woman. Some mocked, some admired, most stayed silent. But one afternoon, something unexpected happened. Grace's idea changed everything. She proposed starting a Warm Hearts Project, a program where people with excess winter clothes could donate directly to shelters. Lila loved it immediately. Together, they pitched it to the board. The executives looked skeptical. One finally said, "We prefer initiatives with media traction. This feels too sentimental." Grace looked down, defeated, but Lila spoke firmly. Sometimes sentiment saves lives. When the project was approved reluctantly, Lila promised herself she'd make it succeed, not just for Grace, but for every invisible soul out there. Neither of them noticed a man standing outside the meeting room door, watching silently, Michael Beaumont himself. His eyes unreadable, his expression tight with something between anger and curiosity. He turned away without a word, but for the first time in years, doubt stirred inside him. Michael Beaumont sat in his office later that evening. The skyline reflected across the floor-to-ceiling windows like fractured glass. His empire, steel, finance, and power, stretched across continents, but for the first time, the thought of control fell hollow. On his desk, a tablet displayed an article already circulating online. Billionaire's daughter hires homeless woman. Compassion or reckless charity? The comments section was split. Some praised Lila. Others mocked her, claiming it was a publicity stunt. But one picture stopped him cold. Grace standing beside Lila, both smiling, arms around each other in front of the foundation's logo. It was the same smile his late wife used to wear. Genuine. Uncalculated. He closed the screen with a sigh, rubbing his temples. "She's her mother's daughter," he muttered, half in frustration, half in longing. The next morning, Lila found him waiting in the foundation's lobby. The staff froze, unsure what to do when the billionaire himself appeared unannounced. His presence was commanding. Crisp suit, cold gaze, air heavy with authority. "Dad!" Lila's surprise cracked into her voice. "We need to talk," he said. They went to her office, a modest room filled with warmth. Small plants, photographs of charity drives, and sticky notes with hopeful quotes. It couldn't have been more opposite from his sterile boardroom. "I saw the project you're running," he said finally, pacing slowly. "This Warm Hearts initiative." "Yes," she replied cautiously. "Grace's idea. It's helping people." He raised an eyebrow. "People don't change because you give them a coat, Lila. You give them a chance, and they take advantage." She met his eyes, calm but fierce. "Maybe they don't need us to fix them. Maybe they just need someone to see them." He stared at her for a long time, expression unreadable. "You sound like your mother." Lila's breath caught. It was the first time he'd said her mother's name in years. She believed in people, too, he continued quietly. "It broke her heart more times than I can count." "She believed," Lila said softly, "and maybe that's why people loved her. You've spent your life building walls. Dad, what if those walls are what's killing you?" He froze. The words hit deeper than she knew. He left without another word, his silence heavier than anger. Grace entered moments later, carrying a stack of donation forms. "Was that your father?" Lila nodded, exhaling. "Yeah." That was him trying not to explode. Grace gave a sympathetic smile. "Maybe he'll come around." Lila looked out the window, where volunteers were loading boxes into trucks. "Maybe," she whispered. 2 weeks passed. The project bloomed beyond expectation. Donations poured in, local news stations covered their work, and more volunteers joined every day. Grace had become the quiet heart of the foundation, guiding others with warmth born of struggle. One night, while sorting blankets at the warehouse, Lila found Grace sitting alone on a stack of boxes, staring at a photo on her phone, a faded picture of her husband. "He would have loved this," Grace said, smiling through tears. "He always believed kindness would come back one day." Lila sat beside her. "It did. Through you." Grace shook her head. Through you, Lila." They sat in silence, the sound of rain drumming softly on the roof. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed outside, a car screeching to a halt, metal against metal. Lila jumped up and ran toward the noise. Across the street, a delivery van had skidded on the slick road and slammed into a post. Smoke hissed from the hood. Without hesitation, Grace sprinted forward, ignoring Lila's shout. "Wait, Grace!" But the older woman was already pulling the van door open, helping the driver, a young man, stumble out. Flames began licking at the edges of the engine. Lila ran to help, grabbing Grace's arm, and together they dragged the man to safety. A moment later, the van erupted in fire. The blast knocked them backward. People screamed. Paramedics arrived minutes later, lights flashing red across the rain. Lila coughed, dazed, as she looked for Grace. "Grace," she called out. She spotted her lying on the ground, motionless, hair matted with rain and ash. Lila's heart stopped. She dropped to her knees. "No, no, no, Grace, stay with me." Her hands shook as she pressed against Grace's chest. "Help! Someone help her!" The paramedics rushed over, lifting Grace onto a stretcher. Her pulse was faint but there. "Breathing shallow, but stable," one said. "We need to move now." Lila climbed into the ambulance without thinking. The sirens wailed as they sped toward the hospital, city lights smearing past the windows. If that moment hit you hard, leave a red heart hash. Sometimes one little symbol says what our hearts can't. Inside the ambulance, Lila gripped Grace's hand tightly. "You're not leaving me, okay? You fought through worse." Grace's eyes fluttered open weakly. "Don't cry. You gave me warmth. I'm not cold anymore." Lila's throat burned. "You don't get to say goodbye. Not yet." Grace smiled faintly. "Tell your father, kindness isn't weakness." Then her hand went still. Lila froze, staring at her face, praying for movement. The world outside blurred, the siren faded, and for a moment, the only sound left was her own breaking heart. The hospital lights were too bright, sterile, unfeeling. They hummed overhead like a cruel reminder that life and death existed side by side in every hallway. Lila sat outside the ICU, her hands covered in dried soot, Grace's scarf still clutched to her chest. Her heartbeat hadn't slowed since the ambulance ride. It pounded in her ears like a drum of panic. Doctors moved past her, their voices low and clipped. Internal injuries, cardiac distress. Words blurred into noise. Lila's eyes were fixed on the small glass window to Grace's room, where machines blinked in rhythm with hope and faith. Her phone buzzed on the bench beside her. "Dad!" She hesitated, then answered. "Lila, where are you? I just saw the news." "She's in the hospital," Lila whispered. Her voice cracked. "Grace, she saved someone's life tonight." Silence stretched through the line. Then her father spoke, quieter than she'd ever heard him. "You're at St. Vincent's?" "Yes." "I'm coming." She didn't respond. She didn't have the strength. She just kept staring at Grace's still body through the glass, remembering every laugh, every tremble, every word of hope the woman had given. Hours passed. The snow outside thickened again, coating the world in white. It was morning before her father arrived. Michael Beaumont looked older than usual, his sharp posture softened by something Lila couldn't name. Maybe guilt, maybe grief. He sat beside her silently. No lectures, no questions, just presence. The same man who once dismissed compassion now looked at his daughter's trembling hands and couldn't find a single word to defend himself. "She went into that fire without thinking," Lila said hoarsely. "She didn't care about herself. She just moved." Michael's jaw tightened. People like that, they remind the rest of us what we've forgotten. For the first time, he sounded human. When the doctor finally came out, both of them stood. "She's stable," he said. "Critical, but alive. The fact she made it this far, it's a miracle." Lila's knees almost gave out. She pressed her palms together in silent gratitude. Her father exhaled deeply. "May I see her?" Lila nodded. Inside the room, Grace looked fragile, tubes, monitors, pale skin. But her chest rose and fell steadily. Michael stood at the foot of the bed, his face unreadable. Then, without warning, he reached out and took her hand. His lips parted slightly, as if confessing to ghosts. "I was wrong," he murmured. "I thought kindness made people weak. But maybe it's what keeps the world alive." Lila turned away, her throat tightening. The man she'd been fighting to reach all her life had finally taken his first step toward her. 2 days later, when Grace finally opened her eyes, Lila was the first thing she saw. "Still here?" Grace rasped. "Always," Lila whispered. Grace smiled faintly. "Tell me the boy's okay." "He's fine. You saved him." Tears shimmered in Grace's eyes. "Then it was worth it." A knock came at the door. Michael stepped in, holding a small bouquet of white lilies. Grace's brows furrowed. "You must be her father." He nodded, almost awkwardly. "And you must be Grace, the woman my daughter keeps proving me wrong with." Grace chuckled weakly. "You raised her well." Michael looked at Lila, emotion breaking through the mask of control. "She raised herself. Maybe now I'll start catching up." For the first time, all three of them shared a fragile, beautiful silence, the kind that spoke more than words could. "Be honest. Could you forgive after what they did? Type forgive if you could, or never if it would break you too deeply." Over the next week, something remarkable happened. Michael quietly ordered the foundation to expand Grace's project. Billboards went up, warm hearts, a second chance for every soul. The logo bore a small heart at its center, drawn from Grace's own design sketch. Grace, still recovering, watched the announcement from her hospital bed. "He really did it," she whispered. Lila smiled. "He did it for you." Grace shook her head slowly. "No, Lila, he did it for you. You reminded him what humanity looks like." Lila took her hand. "Maybe you reminded me first." Outside the window, sunlight cut through the thinning clouds, the first clear morning after days of storm. Michael stood quietly in the hallway, watching them, hands in his pockets. For once, the billionaire didn't think of profits or headlines. He thought of his daughter and the homeless woman who had taught him something no amount of wealth ever could. If you believe love still wins, comment Amen. Let's fill this section with hope. Maybe someone scrolling right now needs to see it. And as Grace's laughter filled the room for the first time since the accident, Lila realized something profound. The coal that once surrounded her life had finally melted, not because of money, not because of power, but because someone had dared to care. Winter began to ease its grip on the city, trading for us for rain and long, golden sunsets that melted across glass towers. The Warm Hearts Project had grown beyond anyone's expectation. Volunteers lined the foundation courtyard each morning, cars pulling up with boxes of blankets, coats, and shoes. Local schools joined in. Cafes put out donation bins. Even strangers on the street began stopping to hand out scarves instead of just glances. Grace, still in recovery, came to the foundation on her first day out of the hospital. Her steps were slow, her voice softer, but her eyes were alive, brighter than ever. The entire team stood to applaud her as she entered, and someone shouted, "Our hero's back." She laughed, embarrassed. No heroes here, just humans remembering how to care. Lila hugged her, long and tight. "You started something bigger than both of us, Grace." Grace smiled. "No, Lila, you started it. I just carried it for a while." That afternoon, a small press conference was held in the foundation's main hall. Cameras flashed, microphones lined the table. Lila spoke first, her voice calm but full of conviction. "Warm Hearts isn't about charity," she said. "It's about connection. It's about remembering that kindness isn't an act of pity, it's an act of courage." When Grace took the podium, the room grew silent. "I once believed my story was over," she began. "But sometimes, all it takes is one person to stop long enough to see you. Lila did that for me. And because of her, I remembered who I was." Michael stood at the back of the room, hidden behind reporters. He didn't need the spotlight. Not this time. His pride wasn't in profits or influence. It was in the way his daughter's voice didn't shake when she spoke about love as though it was the world's most powerful currency. After the event, he found her in the hallway, gathering her things. "You were incredible," he said quietly. Lila turned, smiling. I learned from the best. He frowned slightly. I wasn't exactly a model of compassion. No, she said, but you're learning. That's enough. Michael nodded, emotion flickering in his eyes. Your mother would have been proud. For a moment, the air seemed to still, heavy with memory. I hope she sees this, Lila whispered. She does, he replied. She always did believe in people more than I did. That evening, they drove Grace home to a small apartment provided by the foundation, cozy, filled with light and fresh flowers. Grace ran her fingers over the couch, the curtains, the window that looked out over the park. I never thought I'd have walls again, she murmured. Michael looked around. Quiet. You deserve them. Grace smiled warmly. So do you, Mr. Beaumont. Just different ones, not the kind built for money. He chuckled softly, unaccustomed to being spoken to so gently. Maybe you're right. The three of them shared dinner together. Simple food, laughter, the kind that fills the air and softens old wounds. It was strange how natural it felt, as if they'd known each other for years. Later that night, as Lila helped Grace settle in, Michael stood by the door watching, hands in his pockets, the faintest smile on his face. The walls he'd built his whole life were crumbling, brick by brick, replaced by something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. The following week, Lila received an email from a local school teacher. The students had started a kindness chain inspired by warm hearts, every act of help written on paper hearts, strung together across classrooms. The message spread through social media, reaching cities far beyond their own. Lila showed Grace the photos, eyes shining. You see this? You started a movement. Grace chuckled. We started it. I just reminded people that warmth doesn't cost anything. Michael overheard from the doorway, carrying a tray of coffee. It costs something, he said, setting the cups down. It costs pride, and that's a price worth paying. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the air filled with quiet gratitude. Then Grace said softly, You know, when you first stopped your car that night, I thought you were just another rich girl feeling sorry for me. Lila smiled. And now? Grace looked at her, eyes glistening. Now I know you were a lost girl looking for something real. Lila laughed through her tears. You're not wrong. Grace reached for her hand. You found it, sweetheart, right here. If this story moved you, don't scroll past quietly. Tap like, not for me, but for the soul who carried this pain and still stayed kind. One click can be your way of saying, I felt you. The night deepened outside, but inside that small apartment, 3 hearts, once broken, distant, and cold, finally found the warmth they had been chasing all along. And somewhere, maybe beyond the stars, a gentle soul, Lila's mother, smiled, knowing her family had finally found its way back to the light. Spring washed over the city like a slow exhale. The snow was gone, replaced by blooming trees that painted the sidewalks with pink and white petals. The world seemed softer now, less sharp, and for the first time in years, so did the Beaumont family. Michael began visiting the foundation regularly. At first, the staff whispered in disbelief. The same man who once measured life in numbers now rolled up his sleeves to load donation boxes into trucks. It wasn't for cameras or applause. It was quiet penance, something deeply personal. Lila watched from a distance one morning, smiling as her father bent to lift a crate beside Grace. Careful with your back, Grace teased. Michael laughed, a sound even he seemed surprised by. I've carried heavier things. Guilt, mostly. Grace chuckled, shaking her head. Then you're finally putting it down where it belongs. As days passed, they became an unlikely trio, a billionaire, his daughter, and the woman who had once shivered beneath a street lamp. Together, they attended community meetings, helped expand shelter partnerships, and even visited schools to speak about compassion. One afternoon, Lila found herself sitting in front of a group of high school students. She told them about Grace, not the tragedy, but the strength. She told them about her father, not the power, but the change. And when she spoke about kindness, it wasn't a moral lesson. It was a memory still warm in her hands. A boy in the front row raised his hand. Do you really think one act can change someone's life? Lila smiled gently. No, she said. I think it can change too. Theirs and yours. The auditorium went silent. Grace, sitting in the back, wiped her eyes quietly. Afterward, as they walked outside, Lila caught her father watching her. There was pride there, but also humility, the kind that comes only after breaking open. I used to think you were naive, he said softly. Now I think you just saw the world better than I did. Lila smiled. It's never too late to look again. He nodded. You were right about something else, too. Your mother would have loved Grace. Grace laughed lightly. She sounded like she'd have kept us all in line. She did, Michael said, smiling wistfully. And she believed in goodness even when I couldn't. The three of them walked in silence for a while, through the park that stretched near the foundation building. The air smelled of rain and flowers. Grace stopped beside a bench and looked up at the sky. You ever think maybe we don't meet people by accident? Lila turned to her. I don't anymore. They sat together, the late sun wrapping them in gold. It wasn't a loud kind of joy. It was quiet, steady, earned. Later that night, as Lila closed up the foundation's office, she noticed a small envelope on her desk. Her name was written in delicate, careful handwriting, Grace's. She opened it and read, Lila, if you ever doubt yourself, remember that night by the lamppost. You didn't just stop for a stranger. You stopped time long enough for two hearts to start again. Keep doing that. The world needs it. Love, Grace. Lila pressed the letter to her chest, tears slipping down her cheeks, not from sadness but gratitude. Outside, lights from the city glimmered like stars fallen to earth. If you believe love still wins, comment Amen. Let's fill this section with hope. Maybe someone scrolling right now needs to see it. She looked out the window toward the street where it had all begun, the corner where one act of compassion had rewritten 3 lives. The same lamppost still stood there, glowing softly under the night sky. A homeless man slept nearby, wrapped in one of the blankets from the Warm Hearts Project. Lila smiled faintly. The cycle had continued, not broken, but renewed. And in that moment, she realized something deeper than any lesson she'd ever learned. Kindness doesn't need to be seen to matter. It just needs to be done. She turned off the light, whispering into the quiet, Thank you, Grace. A year passed. The city, once cold and hurried, now pulsed with a quiet kind of kindness, the kind that grows from one story whispered into many. The Warm Hearts Project had become a movement, spreading from one neighborhood to another, crossing borders through screens and souls. People still mention the story of the billionaire's daughter and the woman by the lamppost, not as gossip, but as proof that empathy could still bloom in a world too busy to notice. Inside the Beaumont Foundation, laughter echoed through the halls. Volunteers came and went, each leaving a trace of warmth behind. Grace now managed the outreach division, her desk covered in letters from people whose lives the program had touched. Lila often sat beside her, reading them aloud, messages from children, single mothers, former addicts, each one a spark of light stitched into a growing tapestry of humanity. Michael entered quietly one afternoon, a familiar softness in his stride. He placed a folder on Grace's desk. These are the plans for next year, satellite centers in 3 new cities. Grace's mouth fell open. 3. He smiled. Turns out, goodness scales too. Lila laughed, the sound bright and free. I think that's the first time you've used a business metaphor for kindness. Michael shrugged. Old habits. But I'm learning. Grace leaned back, watching the two of them, father and daughter, once divided by silence, now bound by something stronger than blood. You both remind me that it's never too late to start over, she said softly. Michael nodded, his gaze distant but peaceful. You taught us that, Grace. Both of you did. The afternoon sun spilled through the tall windows, bathing the office in amber light. Dust motes floated like tiny stars, and for a moment, time seemed to hold its breath. As the evening approached, they stepped outside together. The streets were alive, children handing out blankets, strangers sharing coffee, laughter rising from corners where despair once lived. The same lamppost that had witnessed their beginning now stood as a symbol, repaired, shining bright. Grace touched Lila's arm. You know, I used to think fate forgot me that night. But maybe it was just waiting for you to stop. Lila smiled, tears glimmering. Maybe fate was waiting for both of us. They stood there for a while, no headlines, no cameras, just three souls who had finally understood what wealth truly meant. Do you ever miss the old life? Grace asked quietly. Lila shook her head. Not for a second. I used to live surrounded by gold but felt empty. Now I live surrounded by people and feel rich. Michael smiled faintly. Then I'd say you've built a better empire than I ever did. The streetlights flickered on, one by one, chasing the dusk away. Grace looked up at them, her voice barely above a whisper. Funny, isn't it? A single light can change how you see the night. Lila's throat tightened. It can even change how you see the world. They began walking home together, slow, unhurried. Behind them, the lamppost glowed steady, a beacon for anyone lost, a promise that compassion still existed. And though life would move on, seasons turning, faces changing, this story would remain. A daughter who stopped, a woman who believed again, and a man who learned that the greatest fortune is a heart that remembers how to feel. Dizzy, if this story touched you, don't let it end here. Share it, speak it, live it. Because somewhere out there tonight, another soul waits beneath the cold, and your kindness might be the warmth that saves them. #heart-touching story, #emotional story, #inspirational story, #kindness matters, #faith in humanity, #short film story, #billionaire story, #hope lives here, #emotional tales, #moral story.